All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a fascinating and, well, slightly alarming structural critique of the Canadian legal and political system. We're going to be breaking down the work of constitutional lawyer Eva Chipiuk, specifically looking at her book, Reconnect to Canada. This is essentially a massive problem, diagnosis, and solution deep dive into how governance actually works and sometimes fails right here in Canada. Okay, let's dive right into this with a pretty big question. Do Canadians actually understand their own rights? Because Chipiuk argues that there is this massive, kind of hidden gap between the freedoms everyday citizens assume they have and the structural, legal reality of Canadian governance. To get to the bottom of this, our explainer is going to follow a really clear step-by-step diagnostic roadmap. First, we'll look at the civic blind spot, then demystify the charter, examine the vocabulary of power, look at the accountability gap, and finally wrap up with reclaiming the grassroots. All right, starting us off with Section 1, the civic blind spot. This is all about how we're essentially outsourcing governance. So Chipiuk's main premise here is that we've largely handed over our understanding of governance to political elites and corporate media. And that leads to what she calls civic illiteracy. Now, this is a dangerous vulnerability where citizens just lack a basic vocabulary of governance. Think about it. When we don't know the structural rules of the game, we literally cannot recognize when institutional boundaries are being crossed. In that blind spot, it allows potential abuses of power by the government to go completely unseen and unchecked. A perfect example of this blind spot in action is the basic architecture of the Westminster system itself. Because of a lack of systems literacy, a lot of people don't realize that Canada actually operates on a fusion of powers between the executive branch and Parliament. This structural reality actually concentrates an immense amount of authority directly into the Prime Minister's office. Basically, it means your locally elected representatives might have way less actual power than you think. If you don't even know this system exists, you really can't accurately assess how power is being wielded in your country. Moving right along to Section 2, demystifying the Charter, where we examine the limits to our freedoms. Now, what's really interesting here is Chipiuk's pretty provocative description of the Charter. She states that reading Section 1 is essentially like reading a get-out-of-jail-free card for the government over the whole entire thing. You know, a lot of citizens view the Charter as this absolute, untouchable shield. But structurally speaking, Section 1 explicitly allows the government to place reasonable limits on those freedoms. It's not an absolute guarantee. It's actually a legally contested boundary. And sometimes these boundaries aren't even fully tested in court because of a legal concept called mootness. Mootness in litigation happens when a court just dismisses a legal challenge because the underlying policy shifted before a ruling could even be made. Chipiuk points to the COVID-19 travel mandates as an objective case study here. So after a month and a half of presenting evidence in federal court, the government removed the mandates. Poof, gone. The court then declared the case moot and just dismissed it. This means the policy was never actually judged on whether it violated the Charter in the first place, leaving citizens without any clear constitutional precedent. Then we have Section 33, which is widely known as the Notwithstanding Clause. This clause allows governments to temporarily bypass certain charter rights. Now, while it often causes a lot of public panic, with people claiming their fundamental freedoms are completely vanishing whenever it's invoked, Chipiuk demystifies it as a built-in structural tool. It was originally designed to protect provincial autonomy, to avoid deferring all power to the courts. Quebec uses it regularly to assert independence, and Alberta used it during a teacher strike to mandate a return to work. So it's a standard, albeit temporary, governing mechanism, not an apocalyptic end to rights. Let's transition over to Section 3, the vocabulary of power, and how legal terms are misused. There is a really critical difference here that politicians often blur. Let's look at democratic rights versus freedom of assembly. Democratic rights refer strictly to the constitutional right to vote in an election or run for public office. Freedom of assembly, on the other hand, is the constitutional right to gather peacefully in protest. Chipiuk highlights how politicians often loudly complain that a strike or a protest ban is a violation of democratic rights. But legally speaking, in those scenarios, no one is losing their right to vote or run for office. Mislabeling these terms just fuels public confusion and panic because the vocabulary of power is being used entirely incorrectly. Another stark contrast is the difference between sedition and mischief. Sedition is a severe criminal code violation for attempting to overthrow the government. Mischief is a much more minor charge related to obstructing property. Chipiuk uses the Freedom Convoy as an objective case study here. While the political and media narrative frequently tossed around the word sedition, the actual legal charges brought against organizers were just for mischief. When leaders don't use the proper legal vocabulary, they drastically distort the public's understanding of what is actually happening on the ground. Which brings us to Section 4, the accountability gap, and the systemic consequences that come with it. Chipiuk heavily critiques the Canadian system for currently lacking the fundamental legal mechanisms needed to actually hold bureaucrats and leaders accountable. For instance, billions of dollars in public funds can go missing. I mean, imagine doing that at your day job, but there are absolutely no criminal penalties attached to that mismanagement. We see numerous ethics breaches under the Conflict of Interest Act that carry zero structural punishments. Crucially, there are no legal mechanisms to block these violators from simply running for re-election. And the institutional checks we do have, like parliamentary committees, they're easily neutralized or managed by the executive branch. And then there is this number, 4,000. That is the distance in kilometers from the capital, Ottawa, all the way to Western Canada. Chipiuk points out this physical reality to illustrate a massive structural one. It is incredibly difficult to hold a government accountable when they are physically and operationally 4,000 kilometers away from the regional citizens they're actually governing. It creates a massive, massive disconnect. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Reclaiming the Grassroots, where we look at some tactical solutions. Chipiuk is calling for a massive paradigm shift here, brilliantly illustrating the difference between two mindsets. Just contrast the blind spots of the passive subject with the active role of the empowered Canadian. The passive subject believes the Charter is an absolute guarantee, but the empowered Canadian understands Section 1 and actively monitors government overreach. The passive subject just waits around for federal elections every few years to enact change, whereas the empowered Canadian operates locally, using municipal and provincial systems for right now. And while the passive subject relies on top-down, emotional, partisan narratives, the empowered Canadian fosters calm, institutional dialogue right within their own community. So how do you actually become that empowered Canadian? Well, Chipiuk outlines some explicit tactical steps. Step 1, get educated on the basic rules and foundations of the legal system. You absolutely have to know the vocabulary of power. Step 2, organize locally. If you can gather 10 to 100 people around a specific shared issue, you have true leverage. And Step 3, demand answers. This means physically driving to your local representative's office and meeting face-to-face. Real change, she emphasizes, requires this organized, in-person engagement, rather than just arguing endlessly on social media. To show this in practice, consider the current push for Alberta independence. Now, regardless of where you personally stand on the issue itself, it serves as a really powerful objective case study. It proves that committed, organized grassroots action forces elected officials to pay attention far more effectively than isolated online outrage. When citizens organize as a collective unit, they command institutional respect. Which brings us to the ultimate question for you to ponder today. What is your line in the sand to move from a passive subject to an empowered Canadian conscience? At what point do you stop accepting civic illiteracy and start mastering the rules of the system to hold it accountable? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we really hope this breakdown has sparked your curiosity to learn more about the mechanics of your own governance. See you next time.